The morning sun cast long shadows across the private terminal at Los Angeles International Airport as Sarah Mitchell checked her phone one last time. It was 7:30 a.m., and she had arrived early for her 9 a.m. flight, just as she always did. At 42 years old, Sarah had built her software company, TechBridge Solutions, from the ground up over the past 15 years. Now, with offices in 5 cities and over 300 employees, private air travel had become a necessity rather than a luxury. Sarah adjusted her crisp navy blazer and smoothed down her natural hair, which she had started wearing proudly 5 years ago after decades of straightening it. Her mother had worried this choice might affect her business relationships, but Sarah had learned long ago that authenticity was the foundation of true success. Her company's latest achievement, a $50 million contract to develop security software for major banks, was proof of that. As she walked through the terminal's elegant entrance, the clicking of her practical yet stylish leather boots echoed off the marble floors. She pulled along her burgundy Rimowa suitcase, a gift from her team after their first $1 million contract. The familiar weight of her laptop bag hung from her shoulder, containing not just her computer, but also the presentation she would be giving in New York the next morning. The private terminal was quieter than the main airport, with soft classical music playing in the background. The usual morning crowd of business executives and wealthy travelers moved through the space, most of them absorbed in their phones or engaged in quiet conversations. Sarah noticed a young family with 2 small children, probably headed for a vacation, and an elderly couple sitting in the plush waiting area chairs. Martin, the regular morning receptionist who had checked her in dozens of times before, was absent today. In his place sat a new face, a younger woman who smiled warmly as Sarah approached. "Good morning. Welcome to LAX Private Terminal," the receptionist said, her name tag reading Jessica. Sarah returned the smile, reaching for her identification and flight documents. She had everything organized in a leather portfolio, another habit from years of frequent travel. "Good morning, Jessica. I have a 9 a.m. flight to New York," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone used to navigating these spaces. The familiar routine of check-in was interrupted by movement at the security checkpoint. Sarah noticed a new security guard she hadn't seen before, Thomas Reynolds, according to his badge. He was watching the check-in process with unusual intensity, his hand resting on his security radio. Something about his posture made Sarah's expert intuition, the same one that had helped her navigate countless business deals, prickle with awareness. As she waited for Jessica to process her documents, Sarah's mind wandered to the meeting ahead. TechBridge was on the verge of expanding into international markets, and this presentation to potential investors in New York was crucial. In her laptop bag, she carried market analysis reports, growth projections, and a detailed plan for European expansion. The terminal's air conditioning hummed softly, mixing with the quiet conversations around her. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Sarah could see several private jets parked on the tarmac, their metal surfaces gleaming in the morning sun. One of them would take her to New York, where her team was already preparing for tomorrow's presentation. Jessica handed back Sarah's documents with another smile. "Everything looks perfect, Ms. Mitchell. You can proceed to security now. Have a wonderful flight." Sarah gathered her belongings, tucking her passport back into its designated pocket in her portfolio. As she turned toward the security checkpoint, she noticed Guard Reynolds straightening his posture, his expression shifting subtly. In her 15 years of building her company, Sarah had learned to read people well. It was a crucial skill in business. Something in the guard's body language told her this morning might not go as smoothly as planned. Little did she know that the next few minutes would not only test her patience and professionalism, but would also lead to an unexpected opportunity to create lasting change in how people treat each other, proving once again that the biggest challenges often bring the most meaningful transformations. Sarah approached the security checkpoint with her usual confidence, pulling her burgundy suitcase behind her. Guard Thomas Reynolds stood straighter, his eyes narrowing as she got closer. The morning sunlight streaming through the terminal's windows cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression seem even more unwelcoming. "Stop right there," Reynolds said loudly, holding up his hand. His voice carried across the quiet terminal, causing several nearby travelers to look up from their phones. "I need to see your documents again." Sarah noticed immediately that the 3 people who had gone through security before her, all of them white, hadn't faced this extra check. Still, She kept her face neutral and reached for her portfolio. Years of being the only black woman in countless boardrooms had taught her how to handle such situations with grace. "Of course," she said calmly, opening her leather portfolio. "I have everything right here." She presented her ID, passport, and flight documents, the same ones Jessica had just verified at the front desk. Reynolds barely glanced at the documents. Instead, his eyes kept darting between Sarah's face and her expensive luggage. "Who are you flying with today?" he asked, his tone suggesting he didn't believe she belonged there. "I'm flying alone," Sarah replied. "I have a business meeting in New York tomorrow morning." She noticed a few more travelers had stopped to watch the interaction, some with concerned expressions on their faces. "And you're saying this is your private flight?" Reynolds emphasized the word "your" in a way that made his skepticism clear. He crossed his arms, locking the security lane completely now. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering the advice her father had given her years ago. "Your dignity is your armor." She pulled out her phone and, without making it obvious, started recording the interaction. "Yes, it's my flight. I'm the CEO of TechBridge Solutions, and I have an important investor meeting in New York." Reynolds laughed shortly. "Right, and I'm the president. Look, ma'am, if you're here with someone else, just say so. Who's your employer? Which passenger are you assisting today?" The assumption that she must be someone's assistant made Sarah's jaw tighten, but her voice remained steady. "I am not anyone's assistant. I own my company. I've flown from this terminal dozens of times. You can check with Jessica at the front desk, or with Martin, who usually works mornings." A small crowd had gathered now, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly watching the scene unfold. Among them was the elderly couple Sarah had noticed earlier, the woman now whispering something to her husband with a disapproving look toward Reynolds. "I'm going to need to see some additional verification," Reynolds insisted, his hand resting on his security radio. "Maybe a business card, company documentation, proof of flight payment." Sarah heard the whispers around her growing louder. A young businessman in a gray suit, who had passed through security just minutes before without any extra screening, was now on his phone, likely calling the terminal management. "Mr. Reynolds," Sarah said, reading his name tag again, "I provided all the required documentation. I notice you haven't asked for additional verification from any other passengers this morning. May I ask why I'm being singled out?" Reynolds' face flushed red. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. We have security protocols." "Which protocols specifically?" Sarah asked, her voice clear and professional. "I fly through this terminal regularly, and I've never been asked for this level of verification before. I'd be very interested in seeing these protocols in writing." The situation had reached a tipping point. Reynolds seemed to realize he had drawn too much attention. Several phones were now recording the interaction, and the whispers had grown into open discussions about his behavior. Just then, the terminal supervisor's door opened. Linda Chen, a woman Sarah had met several times before, stepped out and quickly assessed the situation. Her expression showed she understood exactly what was happening. As Linda walked toward them, Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart was beating faster than she wanted to admit. She had faced discrimination before, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was because she wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for every person who had ever been wrongly judged based on their appearance. Linda Chen, the terminal supervisor, walked briskly toward the security checkpoint. Her black heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached Sarah and guard Reynolds. The morning sunlight caught the silver name tag on her blazer, making it shine. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," Linda said warmly, having recognized Sarah from her many previous flights. "Is there a problem here?" Her eyes moved between Sarah and Reynolds, who was still blocking the security lane. Before Reynolds could speak, Sarah responded in her calm, professional voice. "Yes, Linda, Mr. Reynolds here seems to have some concerns about my documentation, though I provided everything required. He's asking for additional verification that hasn't been requested from other passengers." Linda noticed Sarah's phone discreetly recording the interaction. Smart woman, she thought. She had always admired Sarah's composure during their previous encounters. "Guard Reynolds," Linda said firmly. "I can personally vouch for Ms. Mitchell. She's a regular passenger through our terminal and the CEO of a successful technology company." She turned to Sarah with an apologetic look. "I'm so sorry for this inconvenience." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, but didn't back down. Ma'am, with all due respect, we can't just take people's word for things. How do we know she's really who she says she is? The crowd around them had grown larger. A young woman in a business suit whispered to her colleague, "Isn't that Sarah Mitchell? I saw her speak at the Women in Tech conference last month." Others were still recording the scene on their phones. Sarah reached into her laptop bag and pulled out a magazine. It was last month's Business Innovation Weekly with her photo on the cover. The headline read, "TechBridge Solutions: How Sarah Mitchell is Revolutionizing Cybersecurity." She handed it to Reynolds without a word. Reynolds' face reddened as he looked at the magazine, then at Sarah, then back at the magazine. The resemblance was unmistakable. Some people in the crowd began to murmur, a few shaking their heads at the guard's behavior. "I could also show you my company website," Sarah said, taking out her iPad. "Or perhaps we could call any of the major tech publications that have featured my work. LinkedIn? Forbes? Take your pick." Her voice remained steady, but there was a hint of steel beneath her calm exterior. Linda stepped forward, her expression serious. "Guard Reynolds, please step aside and let Ms. Mitchell proceed to her flight." She turned to Sarah again. "Ms. Mitchell, would you like to file a formal complaint? I can have the paperwork ready immediately." The terminal had gone quiet. Everyone was watching to see what Sarah would do next. Even the classical music playing softly in the background seemed to have paused at this crucial moment. Sarah looked at Reynolds, who was now staring at the floor, his earlier confidence deflated. She thought about all the times she had faced similar situations, in college, in business meetings, in restaurants. She thought about other people who might face the same treatment but wouldn't have a magazine cover to prove their worth. "Actually," Sarah said, surprising everyone, "I'd like to have a conversation instead." She turned to Linda. "Do you have a private office where we could talk? All three of us?" Linda blinked in surprise but nodded. "Of course, we can use my office." Reynolds looked up, confusion clear on his face. He had expected anger, a complaint, maybe even a lawsuit. But a conversation? This wasn't what he had prepared for. The crowd watched as Sarah calmly collected her magazine and iPad, putting them back in her bag. A few people had recognized her from the magazine cover and were now pointing and discussing among themselves. Some were already posting about the incident on social media. "After you, Mr. Reynolds," Sarah said, gesturing toward Linda's office. As they walked away from the security checkpoint, she could hear people in the crowd praising her composure and professionalism. Linda led them down a short hallway to her office, her mind racing with thoughts about how to handle this situation. She had dealt with complaints before, but something told her this would be different. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any passenger, and this wouldn't be just any conversation. Linda's office was bright and professional, with large windows overlooking the private jets on the tarmac. She gestured for Sarah and guard Reynolds to take seats in the two chairs facing her desk. The tension from the security checkpoint had followed them into the room. Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair, his security badge slightly crooked on his uniform. His face was still red, and he kept glancing at the door as if looking for an escape. Sarah sat calmly beside him, her posture relaxed but professional, her phone now placed on Linda's desk, still recording. "Before we begin," Sarah said, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "I want to be clear about something." She turned slightly to face Reynolds. "I'm not here to get you fired." Reynolds blinked in surprise. Even Linda leaned forward in her chair, curious about where this conversation was going. Outside the office, they could see people at the terminal still talking about what had happened, some pointing toward Linda's office. "Mr. Reynolds," Sarah continued, her voice gentle but firm, "I've spent 20 years in the tech industry. Do you know how many times I've been the only black woman in a room full of executives?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air. "More times than I can count." Reynolds shifted in his chair, his hands fidgeting with his uniform sleeve. "Ms. Mitchell, I was just following security protocols." His voice trailed off, sounding less convinced than before. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "Were you?" "Because I saw at least 5 other passengers go through security before me. None of them were asked for additional verification. None of them were questioned about whether they really belonged here." Linda opened a folder on her desk, pulling out a copy of the terminal's security protocols. "Actually, Mr. Reynolds, Our protocols are very clear about uniform treatment of all passengers. What happened out there? She shook her head. That wasn't protocol. Reynolds looked down at his hands. The morning sun through the windows cast shadows across his face, highlighting the beads of sweat on his forehead. I didn't mean to. He stopped, seemingly unsure how to continue. Let me tell you a story, Sarah said, opening her laptop bag. She pulled out a photo and placed it on the desk. It showed a young black girl in a graduation cap and gown, smiling broadly. This is my niece, Jasmine. She's 14, and she wants to be a pilot. Both Linda and Reynolds looked at the photo. The young girl's smile was infectious, full of hope and dreams. Last week, Jasmine asked me if it would be hard for her to become a pilot because she's black. A 14-year-old girl is already worried about facing discrimination. Sarah's voice remained steady, but her eyes showed deep emotion. What happened out there? That's exactly why she's worried. Reynolds looked at the photo again, then at Sarah. For the first time, his defensive posture began to soften. I have a daughter too, he said quietly. She's 12. Then you understand, Sarah said. Every time someone like you decides I don't belong somewhere, it's not just about me. It's about Jasmine. It's about your daughter. It's about every person who comes after us. Linda watched the interaction with growing interest. In her 15 years as terminal supervisor, she had handled numerous discrimination complaints, but she'd never seen anyone approach it quite like this. So here's what I propose, Sarah continued, straightening in her chair. Instead of filing a complaint, I want to help create a solution. She turned to Linda. Does your staff receive regular training about bias and discrimination? Linda shook her head. We have basic diversity training during orientation, but nothing ongoing. That's where we start then, Sarah said firmly. She pulled out her business card and handed it to Linda. My company doesn't just do cybersecurity, we also have a corporate training division. I'd like to offer our services to the terminal, at no cost. Reynolds looked up sharply, surprise clear on his face. You want to help us? After what just happened? Sarah met his gaze directly. Mr. Reynolds, change doesn't happen through punishment alone. It happens through education, understanding, and sometimes through unexpected conversations like this one. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Jessica, the front desk receptionist, poked her head in. Miss Mitchell, I'm sorry, but your pilot called. They need to know if you'll still make your 9 a.m. departure. Sarah checked her watch. It was 8:15 a.m. Tell them I'll be there, she said confidently. We're almost finished here. Jessica nodded and closed the door quietly. Linda leaned forward, picking up Sarah's business card. Miss Mitchell, your offer is generous, but I have to ask. Why? Most people in your position would be demanding someone's job right now. She glanced at Reynolds, who was still processing Sarah's unexpected proposal. Sarah reached into her laptop bag again and pulled out a worn photograph. This one was older, showing a young black woman in a waitress uniform, standing proudly in front of a small diner. This is my mother, she said, placing the photo next to Jasmine's on the desk. She worked 2 jobs to put me through college. Reynolds and Linda both leaned in to look at the photo. The woman's smile was exactly like Sarah's, determined and dignified. One night, at her second job cleaning offices, someone called security on her. Sarah continued, her voice steady but touched with old pain. They didn't believe she was supposed to be there, even though she had proper ID and was in uniform. The guard was cruel to her, made her sit in the lobby for 2 hours while they verified her employment. Reynolds' face showed recognition, perhaps seeing his own recent actions in this story. He rubbed his hands together nervously, his security badge catching the morning light. The next day, Sarah went on, my mother did something unexpected. She baked a cake and brought it to that security guard. A small smile played on her lips at the memory. She said to me, Baby, sometimes people's hearts are locked up tight. You can break down the door with anger, or you can find the key with kindness. The office fell silent. Outside, planes could be heard taking off in the distance, but in this moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning. My mother taught me that changing people's minds isn't about punishment, Sarah said, looking directly at Reynolds. It's about showing them a different way, the security guard who profiled her. He ended up becoming one of her biggest supporters at that building. He even helped her start her own cleaning business years later. Linda wiped a tear from her eye, trying to maintain her professional composure. Reynolds stared at the photo of Sarah's mother, then at the one of young Jasmine, seeing the connection between generations. "I," Reynolds started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I was wrong out there. Dead wrong." He turned to face Sarah fully for the first time. "My grandfather was a security guard, too. He always told me to trust my instincts, but maybe some of those instincts need to be questioned." Sarah nodded encouragingly. "That's exactly what the training program is about. Not making people feel bad about their biases, but helping them recognize and correct them." Linda picked up her phone. "I'm calling corporate right now. We need this training not just in our terminal, but in all our locations." She paused, looking at Sarah with admiration. "And Ms. Mitchell, if you're willing, I'd like you to be personally involved in developing the program." "Of course," Sarah said, gathering her photos and placing them carefully back in her bag. "Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most difficult moments." Reynolds stood up as Sarah prepared to leave. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. Not just for not getting me fired, but for," he gestured vaguely, struggling to find the words. "For finding the key?" Sarah suggested gently, remembering her mother's words. Reynolds nodded, understanding the reference. "Yes, for finding the key." As Sarah prepared to leave Linda's office, her phone buzzed with notifications. The incident at the security checkpoint had already gone viral on social media. Several passengers had posted videos of the confrontation, and hashtag Sarah Mitchell was trending locally. "You might want to prepare for some media attention," Sarah said to Linda, showing her the phone screen. "These things tend to spread quickly nowadays." Linda sighed, rubbing her temples. "Should we prepare a statement? The terminal's PR team will want to get ahead of this." "Actually," Sarah said, a thoughtful expression crossing her face, "I have a different idea." She turned to Reynolds, who was still standing by his chair. "Mr. Reynolds, would you be willing to be part of something positive?" Reynolds looked uncertain but nodded slowly. "After what you've done for me? Yes, whatever you think is best." Sarah pulled out her iPad and opened her email. "I have a friend at the local news station. Instead of letting this become another viral story about discrimination, we could show people what happens when we choose understanding over anger." Linda leaned forward, intrigued. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A story about transformation," Sarah explained, her fingers moving quickly across the iPad's screen. "About how one difficult moment turned into an opportunity for change. We show people that there's another way to handle these situations." Outside the office, the terminal had returned to its normal rhythm. Through the windows, they could see passengers moving through security, the same checkpoint where everything had started just an hour ago. Reynolds cleared his throat. "You really want to tell people about what I did? Won't that just make the terminal look bad?" Sarah shook her head. "We'll tell them about what you're going to do. About the training program, about your willingness to learn and change. That's the story people need to hear." Linda picked up her phone again. "I just got approval from corporate for the training program. They want to start as soon as possible." She looked at her computer screen. "They're suggesting next week." "Perfect," Sarah said, checking her watch. It was 8:30 a.m. now. "I have some time before my flight. Let's draft a joint statement, from the terminal and from me. Something that focuses on progress and possibility." The three of them spent the next 15 minutes crafting a statement. Sarah's business experience and Linda's knowledge of corporate communications blended well. Even Reynolds contributed, suggesting words that felt authentic and honest. As they worked, Reynolds' phone buzzed. He checked it and his face fell slightly. "My daughter just texted me. Someone from her school saw the video." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes worried. "She's asking if I'm going to lose my job." Sarah paused in her typing. "May I?" She held out her hand for Reynolds' phone. He handed it over, trust now replacing his earlier suspicion. Sarah typed a quick message. "Hi, this is Sarah Mitchell. Your dad and I are working together to make something good happen from this morning's events. He's not losing his job. He's helping make important changes. You should be proud of him." Reynolds read the message, his eyes getting misty. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Sarah replied firmly, "because this isn't just about us anymore. It's about your daughter, About my niece Jasmine, about everyone who will come through this terminal in the future. Linda stood up from her desk. The statement is ready. Should we send it out? Sarah nodded, then turned to Reynolds one last time. Are you ready for this? Once we send this out, you'll be part of the story, part of the solution. Reynolds squared his shoulders, standing straighter than he had all morning. Yes, it's time people saw that change is possible, that we can learn from our mistakes. As Linda pressed send on the statement, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was a message from her niece, Jasmine. Auntie, is that you in the video? You're trending. What happened? Sarah smiled, thinking about how she would tell this story to Jasmine later. About how sometimes the hardest moments can lead to the most important changes. About how her grandmother's lesson about finding the key instead of breaking down the door still worked, even in today's world. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at the airport terminal. Sarah sat in her New York office, reviewing emails on her laptop while CNN played quietly on the wall-mounted TV. Her assistant knocked on the door, excitement clear on her face. Ms. Mitchell, you need to see this. She grabbed the TV remote and turned up the volume. On screen, Linda Chen and Thomas Reynolds were being interviewed about the new training program at the terminal. The changes we've made here aren't just about one incident, Linda was saying to the reporter. They're about creating lasting change in how we treat all our passengers. The camera panned to Reynolds, who looked different now, more confident, but in a humble way. He wore his security uniform with a new badge that read Diversity and Inclusion Ambassador. 2 weeks ago, I made a mistake, Reynolds said to the camera. I let my biases affect how I treated someone. But instead of responding with anger, Ms. Mitchell showed me a better way. He paused, then added, Now I help train other security personnel to recognize and overcome their own biases. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Baby, I just saw the news. Your old mama's cake strategy is going national. Sarah smiled, remembering how her mother's simple act of kindness years ago had inspired today's events. The training program had exceeded everyone's expectations. What started as a single terminal initiative had spread to 3 major airports in just 2 weeks. Sarah's company had received calls from airports across the country, all wanting to implement similar programs. Her laptop pinged with a new email from Linda. Sarah, you won't believe this. We just got a call from the International Airport Council. They want to feature our program at their annual conference. They're calling it the Mitchell Method, using communication and understanding to transform conflict into progress. Linda. As Sarah read the email, another news alert popped up on her screen. A major airline had just announced they were implementing similar training across all their ground operations. They cited the viral video and subsequent transformation at LAX as their inspiration. Her office phone rang. It was Reynolds. Ms. Mitchell, his voice sounded excited. Remember how you met my daughter 2 days ago at the training session? Well, she went to school and gave a presentation about what happened. Her teacher wants me and you to speak at their career day about turning difficult situations into positive change. Sarah thought about all the young people who would hear this story. Tell her we'll be there, she said without hesitation. And Thomas? Please call me Sarah. After hanging up, Sarah opened her laptop to check her presentation for tomorrow's tech conference. She had changed her usual keynote speech. Instead of just talking about cybersecurity, she would share this story. The title slide read, Finding the Key, How One Moment Can Transform an Industry. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo from her niece Jasmine. The 14-year-old had recreated her aunt's stance from the viral video, standing tall and dignified in her school uniform. The caption read, Practicing my CEO pose, starting flight lessons next week. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she looked at the photo. The incident that could have been just another viral moment of racial profiling had instead sparked a movement of real change. A notification popped up on her calendar. In 1 hour, she had a virtual meeting with airport executives from 3 different countries, all wanting to learn about the training program. They weren't just interested in the technical aspects, they wanted to understand the human approach that made it work. Looking out her office window at the New York skyline, Sarah thought about how far things had come in just 2 weeks. The security checkpoint incident could have ended so differently. If she had responded with anger, if Reynolds had refused to listen, if Linda hadn't been open to change, Any of those things could have stopped this transformation before it began. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes people's hearts are locked up tight. You can break down the door with anger, or you can find the key with kindness. Sarah hadn't just found one key. She had helped create a whole set of them, and now they were being passed from hand to hand, opening doors across the country. 1 year later, Sarah Mitchell stood at the same security checkpoint where everything had started. The terminal looked different now. New signs hung on the walls promoting diversity and inclusion, and every security officer wore the special training completion pin that had become a symbol of change. Thomas Reynolds was there too, but not as a security guard anymore. He had been promoted to Chief of Diversity and Security Training for all West Coast terminals. He smiled warmly as Sarah approached, remembering how different their first meeting had been. "Ready for the anniversary ceremony?" he asked, adjusting his new uniform tie. His daughter stood beside him, now 13, wearing a junior pilot's jacket. She had started taking flying lessons, inspired by Sarah's niece, Jasmine. "Almost," Sarah replied, looking around the terminal. "Just waiting for 2 special guests." The automatic doors opened, and Sarah's mother walked in, carrying one of her famous cakes. Behind her came Jasmine, now 15, wearing her student pilot uniform. The young girl had completed her first solo flight just last week. The terminal was filled with people, airport staff, news crews, and aviation industry leaders from around the world. They had all gathered to celebrate what had become known as the Mitchell Moment, the day that changed how airports approached security and human dignity. Linda Chen, now the National Director of Airport Security Relations, stepped up to the podium. "1 year ago," she began, "an incident happened right here that could have been just another sad story about discrimination. Instead, it became the spark that transformed airport security across the globe." The crowd applauded as Linda revealed a plaque that would hang in the terminal. It read, "Where dignity takes flight, home of the Mitchell Method." Below these words was Sarah's mother's quote about finding keys instead of breaking down doors. Sarah watched as Reynolds took the stage. "In the past year," he announced proudly, "over 500 airports worldwide have adopted our training program. Complaints about discriminatory treatment have dropped by 85%, but the numbers don't tell the whole story." He gestured to a group of young people in the audience, teenagers from local schools who had been through the junior aviation program that grew from Sarah and Reynolds' school visit. Among them were his daughter and Jasmine, both dreaming of becoming pilots. "The real change," Reynolds continued, his voice full of emotion, "is in the stories we don't hear anymore. The stories of people being humiliated, discriminated against, or made to feel like they don't belong." Sarah's mother stepped forward then, cutting her cake as cameras flashed. She had baked it using the same recipe as the one she'd given to that security guard many years ago. The story of her cake strategy had become legend in diversity training sessions. As pieces of cake were passed around, Sarah saw Jasmine showing Reynolds' daughter her pilot logbook. The 2 girls had become close friends, united by their love of flying and their connection to this story of transformation. A young security officer approached Sarah, her training pin shining on her uniform. "Miss Mitchell," she said shyly, "I just wanted you to know, your story is the first thing we learn in training now. It reminds us that every passenger has dignity, every interaction matters." The terminal's usual announcements continued in the background, but now they included a new message. "Welcome to LAX Private Terminal, where dignity takes flight. We're proud to serve every passenger with respect and understanding." Sarah looked around at all the faces, her proud mother, determined Jasmine, transformed Reynolds, dedicated Linda, and all the others who had become part of this story. What had started as one tense moment at a security checkpoint had grown into a movement that was changing lives. As if reading her thoughts, Sarah's mother leaned over and whispered, "See, baby, sometimes the key you find opens more than one door." Sarah nodded, watching as another flight crew walked through security, greeted with respectful smiles by officers who had been through the training. The crew was diverse, different races, genders, ages, and they passed through without a second glance. This was the real victory, not just the plaques and ceremonies, but the simple dignity of being treated like you belong, no matter who you are or what you look like. As Sarah prepared to cut another piece of her mother's cake, she knew that this ending was really just another beginning.